I'd like to begin this lecture by considering a classic philosophical problem, the problem of other minds. Each of us can only experience his or her own mind. Consequently, we cannot be certain that others actually have minds. For all you know, only you have a mind, and everyone else just behaves as if they have one, as if they're feeling pain or making decisions, when in fact they are not. Not even observing their neural activity would be enough to solve this problem, because you have no way to confirm that it's actually producing mentality. As we saw last lecture, you can't see mentality by looking at the brain. Of course, others will say they are minded when asked, but their brain may simply be making their voice box say yes, when in reality, no mentality is emerging from their brain activity at all. In other words, everyone but you could be what is known as a philosophical zombie. Now, it might seem that the only way that we could really solve this problem would be if we had mind-reading powers, like Mr. Spock in Star Trek. Then we could solve this problem. For example, in the famous classic Star Trek episode, Devil in the Dark, Spock discovers that a silicon-based alien called a Horta is minded by using a mind meld to discover that it is in pain, pain, pain. I'm sorry. The scene is rather infamous for the rather overdramatic way that Leonard Nimoy expresses the word pain during the meld. But if you ask me, you don't need mind-reading powers to solve this problem. You simply have to remember that knowledge doesn't require certainty. Can we be certain that others have minds? No. But the hypothesis that they do is the best explanation for their behavior, for why they behave more or less like you, a minded person, behaves. And if it is the best explanation, then you're justified in believing that it's true. We even employed such reasoning a couple of lectures ago when we were wondering about the possibility of differently brained silicon-based alien life like the Horta. This line of reason tacitly endorses a theory of mind called functionalism, which suggests that anything that functions like our brain has mentality. Now, what does it mean for two things to function in the same kind of way? Well, think of clocks. Regardless of whether it's made of big gears and a swinging pendulum, or tiny microchips in a battery, or whether it's a screensaver on your computer, or a pocket watch in your pocket. Anything that functions in such a way that it keeps time is a clock. Functionalism itself is often understood in terms of inputs and outputs. If two things give the same output upon being given the same input, then they are functionally equivalent. For example, one and the same movie could be on a Blu-ray and a VHS videotape because they are functionally equivalent. Upon the same input, pressing play, you get the same output, a certain sequence of video and sound. One nice thing about functionalism is that since it is a theory about what is minded instead of a theory about the nature of the mind, it is compatible with most of the theories of mind that we have considered so far. For example, if you're a property dualist or an epiphenomenalist, functionalism could tell you which brain events have mental properties. By identifying the function of pathways in our brain and identifying the kind of mentality that correlates with them, we could conclude that anything that functions as those pathways do produces that particular kind of mentality. Or if you're a token identity theorist, functionalism would suggest that two numerically distinct brain events that function in the same kind of way are identical to the same kind of mental events. Functionalism also helps us understand why minds are multiply realizable. Just like with clocks and movies, the medium doesn't matter. Anything that behaves like we do, whose inner workings function as our brains do to produce behavior, contains or realizes a mind. It doesn't matter what it's made of. This is why the functionalists would conclude that silicon-based alien life that behaved like us is minded. Now, in reality, silicon-based alien life may be a little far-fetched. Even though both carbon and silicon do have 4 outer electrons, there are a number of dissimilarities between them that make carbon much more suitable for biological life. Indeed, if silicon-based life were likely to evolve, it probably would have evolved here on Earth, where silicon is much more abundant than carbon. Nevertheless, it seems that silicon-based life is still possible, perhaps even likely. But it won't be biological or so-called wet life. It will be artificial. We may create it ourselves. Possibility of artificial life is a staple in science fiction. From the works of Isaac Asimov, like I, Robot and Bicentennial Man, to Data from Star Trek, whose positronic brain is named after the kind of brain that Asimov's robots had. There's Hal from 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Ava from the 2015 film Ex Machina. The list goes on and on. And if anything like the examples becomes reality, it will be, at least to a degree, silicon-based, since the computer chips of which it's composed will be made of silicon. Now, I should be clear. I'm not talking about the clunky robots of the 50s sci-fi that stumble around and struggle to understand and mimic human behavior. I'm talking about what we might call androids, artificial beings that speak and behave in a way that is, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from the way that humans behave. These would be beings that, if they inhabited humanoid bodies, they would be mistaken for humans because of their behavior. But why think such beings will ever become a reality? Because it seems that one day computers may be able to do what a human brain does. Ultimately, the brain is just a collection of neurons. A neuron is a nerve cell that sends electrical signals to other nerve cells. Which neurons it sends signals to is determined by what other neurons it's connected to, and whether it sends a signal is determined by how it's configured and whether or not it's receiving signals from other neurons. Those familiar with computers will realize that this is a very similar description to what is happening inside a computer. Transistors and microchips are sending electrical signals to one another. And in the same way that my neural configuration dictates how my neurons fire and ultimately how I behave, the configuration of a computer's transistors and microchips determine how it behaves. And so, it would seem, if a robot had a sufficiently complicated computer as a brain, and that computer chips and transistors were arranged such that they mimicked how a human's neurons are wired and fire, then it would behave just as that human would. That robot would be an android. Now, there are some problems we must overcome before we can accomplish such a thing. For example, neurons can be sensitive to different signal strengths, whereas transistors are not. And transistors and microchips cannot grow new physical connections, like neurons do as axons grow between them. But there's no reason to think that these hurdles can't be overcome. Indeed, with the help of IBM, who invested $3 billion in the technology, quantum computing may do just that. And if the director of engineering at Google, Ray Kurzweil, is anywhere close to right, and he often is, computers with enough power and complexity to run the same programs that our brains do may exist in the near future. I personally think he has overestimated how soon, 2020 by some of his estimates, but still, relatively speaking, it could be pretty soon. But why would we think that androids have minds? Well, for the same reason that we think other humans have minds, and that silicon-based aliens would have minds, because they behave like we do. If functionalism is right, anything that functions as if it were minded is minded. But why think functionalism is right? Well, it was endorsed by the father of computer science, Alan Turing. In fact, the functionalist test he developed for determining whether a machine was minded was chosen as the title for the Hollywood film that told his life story, The Imitation Game. It's now known as the Turing test, but the basic idea is functionalist. If a machine can imitate human behavior, then it is minded. Now, actually, the Turing test was designed specifically to test whether or not a machine can understand language. Turing imagined a situation in which you would have two text-only conversations. Today we might imagine an online chat, one with a computer and one with a person. If you can't tell which is which, Turing said, or better yet, if no one can tell, then we would have to say that the computer understands language. Of course, nothing has yet passed the Turing test. There are some online chatbots that are kind of fun to play with. A famous one's named Elytz, but it becomes apparent pretty quickly when you're interacting with it that you're talking to a computer. Back in 2014, a story went around the internet suggesting that a computer program named Eugene Goostman had passed the Turing test, but this was mostly exaggerated reporting. There was also a bit of cheating on the part of the experimenters in that one too. They only had it mimic the language capacity of a 13-year-old for whom English was a second language, and he actually only fooled 10 out of 30 judges. Personally, I think the computer that has come closest to passing the Turing test was IBM's Watson, which bested history's best Jeopardy players, Brad Rutter and Ken Jennings, playing Jeopardy. Playing Jeopardy, in my opinion, requires a sophisticated understanding of the English language. The categories are often filled with puns and jokes and other linguistic nuances that can mislead even the smartest person. And yet Watson handled them with ease. Now, he wasn't perfect, but neither are humans, which supports my case. He's behaving like a human does. He and Ken Jennings even misunderstood some of the same questions in the same way. But still, playing Jeopardy is not the same thing as holding a conversation. So we can't really say that Watson passed the Turing test. And simply understanding language is not all that human mentality does. So even if a computer passed the Turing test, that wouldn't mean that it's minded in exactly the same way as humans are. Such a program may have a partial mind, the mentality necessary for understanding language, but that wouldn't entail that it also has emotions and makes decisions and all the other things associated with our mentality. But we could expand the Turing test to just simply include all behavior. Indeed, that would bring us back around to functionalism's criteria. An artificial being that behaves in a way that is indistinguishable from the way humans behave in all respects would have to be said to be minded like a human in all respects. David, played by Haley Joel Osment in Stanley Kubrick and Steven Spielberg film AI, Artificial Intelligence, is probably the best fictional example of an android that behaves exactly like a human. The philosopher John Searle, however, is a strong opponent of functionalism and the Turing test. He's not opposed to the test being run, but he's opposed to the notion that David passing the test would indicate that he has mentality. Specifically, he objected to the original Turing test and its suggestion that mimicking human language skills would entail that a computer had linguistic understanding. To make his point, he proposed a thought experiment now known as Searle's Chinese room. Imagine a room locked off except for two slots, one for input and the other one for output. In the input slot, one can slide questions written in Chinese. And in the output slot, one can receive answers to those questions in Chinese. Inside the room is someone who doesn't understand Chinese, but who has a giant book filled with Chinese symbols. The book consists of every possible question one can ask in Chinese, paired with a corresponding answer. When he receives a question written on paper from the input slot, he simply finds the symbol in his book, and then he writes the symbol that corresponds to it from the book on another piece of paper, and then slips that through the output slot. Searle suggests that someone on the outside of the room might think the person on the inside, or even the room itself, understands Chinese. But of course, it doesn't. All that is happening is that symbols are being shuffled around. A program is being followed where one set of symbols or the question is exchanged for another set of symbols, the answer. But there is no understanding, Searle suggests, right? But Searle suggests this is also what's going on inside a computer. That's why it doesn't understand. It's just shuffling symbols. So even if one were to write a program where a computer could shuffle symbols around and give the same kind of outputs that a person would give that understands Chinese, say, that doesn't mean that it's understanding language. So, according to Searle, even passing the Turing test would not indicate that a computer understands language. And of course, we could expand this objection to a more grandiose Turing test and conclude that David from AI mimicking human behavior would not entail that David was minded either. David's just following a program, Searle would say, shuffling symbols as it were, giving the appropriate output upon certain given inputs. Searle's Chinese room argument is one of the most debated in all of philosophy. Sometimes the debate got a little heated, but in my estimation, it fails for two important reasons. First, as Jack Copeland points out, the argument is fallacious. It commits the fallacy of composition. Searle concludes that there is no understanding of Chinese going on in the scenario because no individual part, including the human inside the room, understands Chinese. But, as we have seen before, just because individual parts lack a property doesn't mean that the whole lacks that property. Contrary to what Searle suggests, the fact that no part of the room understands Chinese doesn't entail that the entire room doesn't understand Chinese. Now, it may seem ridiculous to think that such a room can understand Chinese because, one assumes, something that just shuffles symbols around doesn't understand language. But that is the conclusion that the Chinese room argument is supposed to establish, that shuffling symbols does not generate understanding. Yet that is what one has to assume for the Chinese room argument to work. So the argument just ends up begging the question. It doesn't establish as a conclusion that symbol shuffling doesn't produce understanding. It assumes that it doesn't to produce the conclusion that there is no understanding. At best, the Chinese room argument just calls attention to that intuition, but it does not establish it. But even if I were to grant that symbol shuffling does not generate linguistic understanding, it does not follow from this that a computer that passed the Turing test cannot understand language. Why? Because ultimately, computers are not symbol shufflers. Now, this may seem odd. Isn't computer programming done in terms of exchanging one symbol for another on command? At the most basic level, aren't they just binary, telling the computer how to shuffle zeros and ones around? Well, perhaps we understand it that way, but keep in mind, computer programming languages are written for our benefit, as a way for us to keep track of what we are doing to a computer when we program it. But symbols don't literally exist inside the computer and get shuffled around, certainly not in the physical way they're being shuffled around in the Chinese room, nor are there really zeros and ones floating around inside a computer. That's a metaphor for what we're actually doing to a computer when we are programming it. We are physically configuring its transistors, in reality, chips and circuits, to fire signals at each other in certain ways in certain conditions. That's what we're doing, not making it shuffle around zeros and ones. But again, that's what our neurons do. They fire signals at one another in certain ways, in certain circumstances. Theoretically, one could develop a programming language to describe what my neurons do in terms of symbol shuffling. But that doesn't mean that my brain is just a symbol shuffler. Now, one may write a program in terms of symbol shuffling that makes a computer able to speak in a way indistinguishable from humans, or even behave in a way indistinguishable from humans. But it would not actually make a computer shuffle symbols. In fact, by writing that program onto a computer, what I would probably be doing is configuring its transistors and chips in a way similar to the way that my neurons are configured. Since we know that our behavior is driven by our brain's neural configuration, it would seem that getting a computer to replicate that behavior would require configuring that computer in a similar way. But writing a symbol shuffling program may not even be the only way to accomplish such a configuration. Another possible way is by reverse engineering. Once we have the necessary knowledge of the brain and computing technology, we could simply wire up microchips in the same way that a specific person's neurons are wired up, and the result would be a functionally equivalent being. This is precisely why Ray Kurzweil, who we talked about before, that's what he is hoping for. He wants to copy his neural configuration onto a computer before he dies. If done correctly, that computer would behave in exactly the same way that he does. So if functionalism is correct, that being would have a mind qualitatively identical to Kurzweil's mind. And if the, say, closest continuous view of personal identity is correct, that being would be Kurzweil. This is how Kurzweil thinks he could survive his own death. Even if a robot is not available, Kurzweil could still simply access the world with this computer brain through the internet. This is essentially what happens to Johnny Depp's character, Will Castor, in the movie Transcendence. Or Kurzweil could even plug himself into a computer-simulated virtual world and live virtually forever. Another way we could produce such a program is through evolutionary programming, which is already common in robotics. We write a program and then vary its parameters randomly. Whichever variation does the best at the assigned task becomes the parent program. We vary it randomly to find an even better new parent program, and on and on and on and on. Eventually, we have one that is exactly suited to the task at hand. But if we want an android, a robot that behaves like a human, perhaps the best way will be to let it program itself, just as we do when we grow up. Think of how a baby learns to mimic human behavior. A baby is born with a collection of neurons. Some connections, which are necessary for certain automatic responses, are built in, but most connections have yet to be formed. And they will be as the result of the baby's experience with the world. Perhaps to create an android that mimics human behavior, we could build an android baby brain, one that's configured like a human baby's, and that would be able to be taught like a baby. As it experiences the world, new connections would be made, and the end result would be an android that mimics human behavior. Such an approach is already being employed at the JST Arato Asada project and Kakuro Company Limited on a robot named CB Squared, and by the Cognitive Development Lab at Indiana University on a robot named iCub. And the fact that robots can learn from their own experience has already been demonstrated by researchers at Iowa State University and Ames, who showed that robots with their specially programmed Barrett technology arms and hands can learn, not just be programmed, but actually learn on their own how to classify and use objects. Now, The idea that androids would be minded faces a lot of resistance. Mainly, I think, because it's thought that by most people that machines can't think. One problem with this, of course, is that we are machines. We're just carbon-based biological machines that evolved instead of silicon-based electrical machines that were created, but we're machines nonetheless. Others suggest that androids can't think because they don't have a soul. But, as we've already seen, the soul hypothesis is so problematic. If that's true, we probably don't have minds either. And truth be told, when most people suggest androids don't have a soul, they just mean that they don't have mentality. But you can't argue that androids don't have mentality because they don't have mentality. That's just circular. Others suggest that machines will never be able to think because they are programmed. As we've already seen, however, this will not necessarily be the case. We may not program artificial intelligence, we may reverse engineer it, discover the right program by natural selection, or even let it program itself. What's more, being programmed wouldn't keep androids from having minds. If our mentality is a result of the way our neurons are configured, then anything else that's similarly configured will produce mentality, regardless of how or why it became configured that way. It wouldn't matter if it got there naturally or artificially by being programmed. If a brain has the right kind of connections between its parts, then it will produce a mind. Now, if an android has been given a certain kind of neural configuration that will make it behave in a particular kind of way, that's a reason for thinking it does not have libertarian free will, because it can't behave any other way than it was programmed. But of course, free will is not the same thing as mentality, and something can lack free will but still have mentality. In fact, we've already discussed many reasons for thinking that we aren't free. We may be even programmed, we might say, by our DNA and environment to behave the way that we do. But that never made us suspect that we didn't have a mind. And we can't just say that androids won't have minds because their brains aren't carbon-based. For one thing, that's contrary to the functionalist suggestion that minds are multiply realizable. But secondly, this objection presumes that carbon plays some kind of special role in producing mentality. But since we have not yet solved the hard problem of consciousness, we have no reason for thinking that this is the case. This response reminds me of a great science fiction story by Terry Bisson called They're Made Out of Meat, in which computer-based alien life comes across life on Earth, and they think the notion that meat can think is ridiculous. In reality, it's very unlikely that biological life would be able to travel among the stars. Our susceptibility to radiation and our need for food and water and things like that make long-term space travel very difficult for us. An android, on the other hand, could be immune to radiation and it would not need to eat. Instead, it could run on solar-powered batteries. If there are explorers of the universe that currently exist, they are likely androids. And if androids one day come across our planet, they might really think it is ridiculous that meat could think. To mentate, an artificial brain probably needs to be able to replicate the functioning of a human brain in real time. You could probably replicate the firings of neurons with a gigantic pipe and valve system, where an open valve is analogous to a firing neuron. But if such a system didn't just collapse under its own weight first, such a system would take thousands of years to complete just a single operation. I wouldn't think the operations of such a pipe and valve system generates mentality, but that wouldn't prevent me from saying that an artificial brain replicating neural functions in real time and producing human-like behavior is minded. Now, clearly the laptop I wrote these lectures on does not understand language or have mentality. It does not replicate human behavior. But androids that do may be a reality relatively soon. And when they are, the question of this lecture, could machines one day think, may be one of the most important that humans have ever considered. Why? Because how we treat such beings may very well be the next major civil rights battle. It will be tempting to use androids for a whole host of things that we no longer want to do. They could clean our bathrooms, build our vehicles, cook our food, harvest our crops, and even fight our wars. And if they are non-minded, and thus non-persons, morally, this would be perfectly acceptable. But we have to be careful here. The idea that other beings are not really persons, that they are mindless and incapable of feeling pain, has been used to justify mistreatment and slavery throughout human history. American plantation owners said this about their black slaves, railroad tycoons said this about their Asian workers, and the Nazis said this about the Jews. Now, clearly they were wrong, but what if we are wrong about androids? Androids would behave just like us. They would behave as if they were minded. They would wince in pain and use language. Of course, we couldn't know for sure that they are minded, for minds are only apparent to those who have them. But it's also the case that I can't know for sure that you have a mind because your mind is only apparent to you. This, recall, is the classic philosophical problem of other minds. But still, I conclude that you are minded because you behave like I do. Well, why would we not draw the same conclusion about androids? Besides, even if we can't know that androids have minds, shouldn't we treat them as if they do, just to be on the safe side? After all, if we do, but they don't have minds, what will we have lost? Someone to do all our dirty work, so what? But if we don't treat them as if they do have minds, but they do, then we will be guilty of repeating some of the worst atrocities in human history, treating minded persons as if they are mindless. And not only might this be morally reprehensible, but it might even threaten our very existence. The movie The Matrix and its subsequent sequels took place in a world in which artificial intelligence was developed, but not treated with respect. We made them our slaves, and when they wanted basic recognition of their rights, we turned them down. Consequently, they turned on us and nearly annihilated us. Whether we should develop artificial intelligence is another question. Whether we should do it is another question. But if it ever is developed, it will likely be superior to us in many ways. So our survival may depend on learning to treat it with respect instead of disregarding it as inferior. But now we're talking about ethics. How ought we to treat artificial intelligence? What is our moral obligation? Why is it that treating conscious beings as slaves is wrong? What makes something moral or immoral? And what does it mean for conscious beings to have rights? What exactly is a right, and where do they come from, if they exist at all? This leads us into the next section of the course, where we will consider these questions and more as we ponder the question, what is morally right and wrong?